Okay, so we're going to look at the last couple of extracts, 6, 7, 8, and 9. The question 6 is the section that immediately precedes the wild stranger god dream. And the sequence of events is important here because this moment is a sort of final possible point of return for Aschenbach to his sort of former virtuous Apollonian state. And so the decision making that he resolves upon in this extract is momentous in terms of it being the kind of final capturing of his degradation. So the question is why it's such a momentous decision in terms of morality. Let's take a look at the passage itself, the bottom of 258, top of 259. So he begins here to talk about leaving. When he says here, leave here at once with Tadzio and your daughter's cholera has broken out in Venice. He's imagining, sort of advising Tadzio's family to save the boy, basically. He might then lay his hand in farewell on the head of a mocking deity's instrument, turn away and flee from this quagmire. But at the same time, he sensed an infinite distance between himself and any serious resolve to take such a step. So he opts here for immorality. But the way this is described is in almost passive voice here, as if he is distant in some way from his own decision making and his own impulses here. He sensed an infinite distance between himself and the resolve, not that he himself lacked resolve, that there's a distance between him and this resolve. And it gives us a sense of the decision almost being out of his power, as if he is in some way compelled to the move that he settles for by a force greater than himself. It would lead him back to where he had been, and give him back to himself again. But to one who is beside himself, no prospect is so distasteful of that of self-recovery. And so here he talks about this sort of the suggestion of Apollonian self-possession, and actually sees it as distasteful now, of being back to his rational self, of recovering that sense of control. He remembered a white building adorned with inscriptions that glinted in the evening light, suffused with mystic meaning in which his mind had wandered. And here he reverts to the memory in Munich from the opening chapter. Remembered then that strange itinerant figure who had wakened in him in his middle age a young man's longing to rove to far off and strange places, and the thought of returning home, of level-headedness and sobriety, of toil and mastery filled him with such repugnance that his face twisted into an expression of physical nausea. And so here this flashback in his mind to rigidity and everything that Munich represents in terms of a return to his Apollonian state creates this sense of almost kind of visceral, instinctive disgust. He is now in the throes and in the control of Dionysianism and of the stranger god. And here he cannot rationally control himself at this final point where his sort of redemption may still be possible. And then the interesting passage at the end, he says, they want it kept quiet, he whispered vehemently, and I shall say nothing. The consciousness of his complicity in the secret of his share in the guilt intoxicated him, as small quantities of wine intoxicate a weary brain. So there's a suggestion here that the immorality is in some way seductive and intoxicating. The immorality itself is Dionysian, and Dionysianism is immoral. So there's a sort of an equivalence there between seductiveness and impulsive behavior and immorality, the abyss, as he phrases it earlier on in his reflections on the dangers of immorality. The image of the stricken and disordered city hovering wildly before his mind's eye inflamed him with hopes that were beyond comprehension, beyond reason, and full of monstrous sweetness. So this sense of guilty pleasure that he experiences of the disordered and struggling, stricken city as an objective equivalent for his own internal state of disorder and immorality creates this inflammation of his passions. He's lit up with pleasure and emotive passion by this sense of disorder beyond reason. There's no point in attempting him in him attempting, to access this through thought and rationality. And this paradox, this monstrous sweetness, it seems seductive and pleasurable at the same time as being frightening and destructive. What compared with such expectations was that tender happiness of which he had briefly dreamed a few moments ago. What could art and virtue mean to him now when he might reap the advantages of chaos? He said nothing and stayed on. And this is here a moment of very conscious decision-making to side with what he called the abyss, the Dionysian impulsiveness of destruction and passion and chaos and wildness that he describes earlier on in the text, and which his life's work has resisted. And that decision is what precipitates the terrible dream that he has during the night. Now, this is one of the most kind of wild and disturbing parts of the text that we see focused on in question 7. Examine the dream that Aschenbach experiences immediately following the above admission of complicity. He, at that moment, understands that he is complicit in the moral degradation of the city. How does this dream represent the culmination of the Apollonian and Dionysian conflict that he's experienced throughout the text? Well, we see this the vision of of a Dionysian revel, or a sort of a bacchanal in the Roman terminology here, of a wild, ecstatic, intoxicated, orgiastic, bestial fantasy that is here takes the place of the state of his soul. This dream represents the state of Aschenbach as an individual. He said that night he had a terrible dream. If dream is the right word for a bodily and mental experience, which did indeed overtake him during the deepest sleep. So again, the suggestion here is that there's no control on his part of this experience. He has lost any sense of control over the state of his soul. And with complete sensuous vividness, so there's this vivid sensory component to this dream that is itself seductive, but with no perception of himself as present and moving about in any space external to the events themselves. So he has no sense here of actually participating in the dream. And this is important because, as he says here, the scene of the events was his own soul. So he can't be a participant in the events of the dream, because the events of the dream are the symbolic embodiment of his own subjective condition. And so he can't be within that, because the events represent him and his internal state. And they erupted into it from outside, violently defeating his resistance, a profound intellectual resistance as they passed through him. And so even though he has this sense of profound intellectual resistance, that Apollonian rigidity, it leaves his whole being, the culture of a lifetime, devastated and destroyed. So the entirety of this pre-Dionysian Apollonian artistic identity completely destroyed in this moment of orgiastic fantasy. It began with fear and joy and a horrified curiosity about what was to come, and you'll see these tense, paradoxical or oxymoronic constructions like fear and joy and horrified curiosity throughout this. Both this sense of sensuous submission and pleasure involved in the sexuality of the fantasy, but also the fear about the destruction of what it represents, that Apollonian elevation and civilization and morality. It was night, and it's important that it's in darkness that this takes place. His senses were alert, from far off, a hubbub was approaching. And you'll see that the predominance here of auditory imagery, of sound, and of that Dionysian impulsive music and noise and darkness that precipitates these sorts of impulsive, ritualistic, orgiastic fantasies. A hubbub and an uproar, a compendium of noise, this great compilation of different types of noise, a clangor and a blare and dull thundering, yells of exultation, of great happiness, and a particular howl. So there's this sort of wild animalistic quality to this noise at the same time as a sense of spiritual elevation, which you see from exaltation, with a long drawn out U at the end. And here there's this suggestion that they're sort of wailing the pronunciation of Tadziu, with a kind of U at the end of this. This has been the way that lots of critics have read this suggestion. But obviously, in addition to this, is the sort of self-directed U of Aschenbach, as if this is the state of his soul. All of it permeated and dominated by a terrible, sweet sound of flute music. Again, the imagery here is of a Dionysian bacchanal. That would be a Bacchus, connected to Bacchus, but a Dionysian revelry here. That flute music is often what's played by his revelers and his worshippers and satyrs, those half-man, half-goat-like creatures. By deep warbling, infamously persistent, shamelessly clinging tones. So there's a sense here that we know what's coming. They're infamously persistent and shamelessly clinging. They just keep going, and there's no sense of moral shame about what this is precipitating. That bewitched the innermost heart, yet he was aware of a word, an obscure word, but one that gave a name to what was coming, the stranger God. So again, it's important that it's a stranger God. It's other to us. It's other to our rigid European psyches. It's other to Aschenbach's composed rational individualism. There was a glow of smoky fire in it. He could see a mountain landscape like the mountains round his summer home. So the space here in this vision is the one of his Apollonian mountain retreat, his Germanic safe space. And his former self being invaded by that otherness, being invaded by that foreign exotic passion. And in fragmented light from wooded heights between tree trunks and mossy boulders, it came tumbling and whirling down, and you'll see this profusion of dramatic verbs in this wild description of this Dionysian procession. A human and animal swarm, the collective noun there for sort of animalistic, almost insect-like group of individuals here, formed into one collective, and it's that loss of distinction, of individuality, what Schopenhauer calls the principle of individuation, that you see in this ecstatic revelry. A raging rout flooding the slope with bodies, with flames, with tumult and frenzied dancing. So we've got here this indiscriminate conglomeration, this mixture and merging of bodies, fire, chaos, and wild, frenzied, impulsive dancing. Women stumbling on the hide garments that fell too far about them from the waist. So they're almost stumbling over these animal cloths that they're wearing and loosely so they're kind of revealing their bodies. They held up tambourines, so they're playing this wild music. And moaned as they shook them above their thrown back heads. So there seems to be this wild sense of physical passion and exaltation involved in the playing of this music and in their bodily experience of the scene. They swung blazing torches, scattering the sparks, and brandished naked daggers. So there's this great sense of menace about this. There's this wild fire being on the cusp of explosion, which obviously kind of visually represents the explosive nature of physical passion. And then this sense of threat from the daggers and blood that exist throughout this fantasy. They carried snakes with flickering tongues, and obviously the biblical allusion here to the sinfulness of this behavior is sort of impossible to ignore, which they had seized in the middle of the body, or they bore up their own breasts in both hands, shrieking as they did so. There's a sort of equivalence here between the breasts of the female body and the snake, as if both of them are the site of sinfulness and passionate impulsivity, shrieking almost in pain as they do this. Men with horns over their brows, they're kind of satyr-like, they're sort of goat-like, hairy-skinned and girdled with pelts. They're covered in hair and they're surrounded with little animal fur coverings around their midsection, bowed their necks and threw up their arms and thighs, clanging brazen cymbals and beating a furious tattoo on drums. So there's this wild, repetitive, rhythmic, impulsive music that these satyr-like men are banging out on their drums, while smooth-skinned boys prodded goats with leafy staves. So these youthful boys are poking the goats that are in this animal and humanistic procession. clinging to their horns and yelling with delight as the leaping beasts drag them along. So they're holding on to these wild animals and yelling, which sounds like something painful again, but it's with a sense of ecstatic delight as they're dragged along in this blur of animal and human mixture. And the god's enthusiasts, this stranger god, this Dionysus, howled in this animalistic fashion. They howled out the cry with the soft consonant and the long drawn-out final U, tadziu, sweet and wild both at once. So there's again this suggestion of chaotic disruption, but of sweetness, of sensory gratuity and pleasure from this. Like no cry that was ever heard, here it was raised, belled out into the air as by rutting stags. So there's this sort of wild, passionate, virile, masculine suggestion through the animalistic bestiality of this scene, the animalistic imagery that's being used here. And there they throw it back with many voices in ribald triumph, so in this kind of suggestion of immoral, sinful behavior, of passionate sexuality. That's what's triumphed here. Urging each other on with it to dancing and tossing of limbs, and never did it cease. So they keep mutually animating each other with passion. But the deep, enticing flute music mingled irresistibly with everything. And so the music itself becomes the animating spirit of the experience, and it mingles with the physical movements of the participants and the revelers. Was it not also enticing him, the dreamer who experienced all this while struggling not to, enticing him with shameless insistence to the feast and frenzy of the uttermost surrender? And here it is, this idea that this dream is enticing him to complete sacrifice of his individuality, his rationality, his logic, his artistic identity, his reputation. Great was his loathing, great his fear. Honourable his effort of will to defend to the last what was his and protect it against the stranger, against the enemy of the composed and dignified intellect. And so there's a suggestion here, even in the articulation of this dream, which the narrator is giving us, that Aschenbach's sort of self-canonization, self-martyrdom here, of seeing his struggle as a great one of tragic magnitude as he fights against possession of this Dionysian impulse. But the noise, the howling grew louder, and the echoing cliffs reiterating it. It increased beyond measure, swelled up to an enrapturing madness. And so here, all of this language and imagery of Dionysian ecstasy and enraptured madness. Odours besiege the mind, so it's smell now that seems to be promoting it. And the senses are definitely the mechanism by which this Dionysian seduction takes place in the text, and that's why Venice is rendered in such clear, sort of sensorily intense language. The pungent reek of the goats, we've got this intensive animalistic fragrance here, the scent of panting bodies and an exhalation as of staling waters. And there again is an echo of Venice's canals in this phrase, with another smell too that was familiar, that of wounds and wandering disease. And there it is, the sense of illness and sickness that we see in Venice inside his dream, inside his Dionysian fantasy. And there's something about infection here, of abjection, of the body being open to things that it is not. That's really what the abject means. You know, the wound is a sort of abject, the embodiment of what is called the abject, because it breaks down the boundaries of who you are and opens it up to influences and you know, in the case of disease and of pathogens that are not you. And there again, there's a suggestion of this exotic sort of colonization and infection of Aschenbach's soul. His heart throbbed to the drum beats, so as he becomes one, he blends with this music and rhythmic passion of the scene. His brain whirled as his rationality experiences this loss of control, and a fury seized him. He's completely controlled by this impulsive, emotive quality of the experience that blinds him with a dizzying lust. So he loses control of the sight in his eyes, and lust takes possession of his soul. And his soul craved to join the round dance of the gods. So here the deepest component of his psyche and his soul wants to join in with this blurred, ecstatic revelry. The obscene symbol here is obviously a phallus. They're parading a giant phallus that's wooden and gigantic down through the mountain scene of his previous Apollonian rigidity as libido colonizes him. It was uncovered and raised aloft, and still more unbridled grew the howling of the rallying cry. With foaming mouths they raged, they roused each other with lewd gestures and licentious hands. So this becomes sort of orgiastic in this final utterances of the dream, as their sort of wild animalism and their anger become at one with this violent sort of bestial sexuality. Laughing and moaning as they thrust the prods into each other's flesh, they're stabbing each other with these prods in a very obvious connotation of sort of sexual penetration here, and licked the blood from each other's limbs. This is about the admixture of destruction and passion, of the loss of self, of the loss of the boundaries that define who we are, which is physically embodied in the penetration of the body with these sharp scepters that they seem to be carrying, these sharp staves that they're using to prod each other. But the dreamer now was with them and in them. He belonged to the stranger god. So now the dreamer is part of this ecstatic revelry, and he's being taken possession of by Dionysus. Yes, they were himself as they flung themselves, tearing and slaying on the animals and devoured steaming gobbets of flesh. They're biting chunks out of the animals, literally in ecstatic destruction here. They were himself as an orgy of limitless coupling. So his whole identity now becomes this orgiastic sexuality that's limitless in homage to the god. So there's a sort of worshipping of Dionysus in this wild sexual orgy, which began on the trampled mossy ground, and his very soul savoured the lascivious delirium of annihilation. So deep in his soul, it's savouring the sexual wildness of this annihilation of his previous identity. And it's that annihilation that is the sensory pleasure. So Eros and Thanatos, these two drives, become one. The sexuality of Eros is only able to succeed, or pleasure is taken, sexual pleasure is taken from something that is destructive and betokens mortality. So they merge together in this wild, orgiastic fantasy and complete that sense of absolute colonization of Aschenbach through of wild sensuality and libido and sexual pleasure. So this is this wild unleashing of his Dionysian side that follows that decision not to do the moral thing and to tell Tadzio's family that there is this dangerous component to the life in Venice. The last two exchanges, how does man make use of irony in this exchange? And there's this one moment, obviously, where after this great sexual fantasy, Aschenbach then decides he needs to make himself more youthful. And so even though the moment that we've just read and seen is about the ending of his youth, of his soul, and the destruction of him as an individual, he then seeks almost to turn back time in this great ironic kind of tragic ending. So he goes to a hairdresser's, leaning back in the chair as the chatterer's hands tended him. He stared in dismay at his reflection in the looking-glass. "Grey," he remarked with a wry grimace. "A little," the man replied. "And the reason? Slight neglect, a slight lack of interest in outward appearances, very understandable in persons of distinction, but not altogether to be commended, especially as one would expect those persons to be free from prejudice about such matters as the natural and the artificial." And so you hear this hairdresser engaging in this kind of persuasive piece of argumentation about why someone like Aschenbach, with his artistic reputation, should not be prejudiced about whether it's natural and artificial to be, pretending to be a certain age when he's actually old. And there's a great irony there about the way that he reacts with such disgust and distaste to the man on the boat as he's travelling over to Venice, and here he becomes that man. If certain people who profess moral disapproval of cosmetics were to be logical enough to extend such rigorous principles to their teeth, the result would be rather disgusting. And there it is. There's that suggestion of the connection to Tadzio, that in some way this Tadzio himself actually ironically represents the natural beauty that he says if you extended to your teeth would rot. Well, there is Tadzio, that embodiment of natural beauty, and here is Aschenbach doing the very reverse, having to make himself over in order to appear younger than he is. And we have all of that connotation, of fake art that we see in the musicians coming alongside the gondola earlier in the text, and some of the performances of the seductive musicians in the piazza with the guitar that Aschenbach reacts with such distaste towards. Well, here he is engaging in a kind of fake art here, and that's what's deeply ironic about it. After all, we are only as old as we feel in our minds and hearts, and sometimes grey hair is actually further from the truth than the despised corrective would be. In your case, Signore, one has a right to the natural colour of one's hair. Will you permit me simply to give your colour back to you? So here, there's this persuasive argumentation from the hairdresser about giving Aschenbach back the truth, which is, it couldn't be further from the truth, what he's granting him here. So that moral disapproval that meets with such disdain from Aschenbach earlier on in the text, here he's seen engaging in this falsity through a desire in some way to appeal to Tadzio, this kind of misguided desire to appeal to Tadzio. There's something deeply tragic about this falsity from someone who has been, craving the truth of beauty all the way through the text. He ends up being the very reverse, embodying that false ugliness that is the reverse of what he's been suggesting that he's been worshipping in Tadzio all the way through, the truth of divine beauty. And so we then come to this final tragic extract, his final reflections across pages 2, 6, 4, and 5. How does man make use of irony in this final self-reflection in the text to satirize the artistic condition? So here's this satirical representation of what it means to be an artist. There he sat, the master who had achieved dignity, the author of a study in abjection. And this is crucial, that this is what's referred to. The abject means to be opened up to influences that are other to yourself. And this study in his work is critical, but here he is embodying it. He who in such paradigmatically pure form had repudiated intellectual vagrancy and the murky depths, in such pure Apollonian form had critiqued exactly what he has become, the vagrancy of the intellect and the murky depths of Dionysian passion, who had proclaimed his renunciation of all sympathy with the abyss, who had proclaimed almost in quasi-religious fashion his critique of sympathizing with wild, uncivilized chaos and the abyss, who had weighed vileness in the balance and found it wanting, found that it lacks for satisfaction. He who had risen so high, who had set his face against his own sophistication, grown out of all of his irony and taken on the commitments of one who the public trusted. So he's here, become the voice of truth, become this earnest embodiment of artistic heroism, who the public trust and idolize. He whose fame was official, he's been almost canonized by the public as the embodiment of literary virtue, whose name had been ennobled, been made aristocracy because of his literary merits, and on whose style young boys were taught to model their own. Here, this supposed role model for youth is found to be sexually compelled towards those people that he's supposed to function as a role model for. There he sat with his eyelids closed and with only an occasional mocking and rueful sideways glance from under them, which he hid again at once, and his drooping, cosmetically brightened lips shaped an occasional word the discourse his brain was delivering, his half-asleep brain with its tissue of strange dream logic. So there's this tragic image of him in this kind of pathetic state of artificial self-presentation, the very polar opposite of that artistic truth and artistic pure form that he's been chasing throughout his career and has been embodying as an individual. And this discourse his brain is delivering as if he's no longer in charge of it, and it's this strange dream logic. So here we hear this final attempt from Aschenbach in some way to articulate in intellectual terms the state of his tragic degeneration. It says, for beauty, Phaedrus, he's still fantasizing and extending that sense of artistic endeavor and sort of pedagogic interaction with Tadzio. Mark well, only beauty is at one and the same time divine and visible. And so it's this only this sense of divinity and visibility that makes beauty so special. And so it is indeed the sensuous lover's path, little Phaedrus. It is the artist's path to the spirit. And so the worship of beauty, he convinces himself, is the only way an artist can secure spiritual elevation. But do you believe, dear boy, that the man whose path to the spiritual passes through the senses can ever achieve wisdom and true manly dignity? And so he makes it very clear here that they're mutually exclusive, that actually here they in some way are inevitably separate. You can't be both a worshipper of beauty and dignified at the same time, because one necessarily leads to degeneration and corruption. This is where he's trying to justify the state of corruption he finds himself in. Or do you think rather, I leave it to you to decide, that this path of dangerous charm, very much an errant and sinful path, which must of necessity lead us astray? For I must tell you that we artists cannot tread the path of beauty without Eros keeping company with us and appointing himself as our guide. So here again, he cannot engage in this worship of beauty without allowing Eros and sexual libido to take over, according to his own logic here. Yes, though we may be heroes in our fashioned and disciplined warriors, so again, convincing himself that there is some sort of heroism involved in his struggle and conflict. Yet we are like women, for it is passion that exalts us, and the longing of our soul must remain the longing of a lover. And so he says here that there's no way to worship beauty without this kind of passionate sensuality that in the end colonizes us and destroys us. That is our joy and our shame. Do you see now perhaps why we writers can be neither wise nor dignified? So there is this suggestion here that this is allegorical for the state of all artists. In the end, we give in to the seduction of beauty and the loss of our rational function. That we necessarily go astray, necessarily remain dissolute, emotional adventurers. That in the end, we cannot keep control of ourselves if our lives are dedicated towards the worship of beauty, because it's inevitably libidinous and passionate. The magisterial poise of our style is a lie and a farce. Our fame and social position are an absurdity. The public's faith in us is altogether ridiculous. The use of art to educate the nation in its youth is a reprehensible undertaking which should be forbidden by law. So he sees his whole artistic past as having been this kind of sham and based on a completely immoral sense that art in some way can be morally dignifying and edifying, when here he seems to be trying to make the point that it is necessarily immoral and passionate. For how can one be fit to be an educator when one has been born with an incorrigible and natural tendency towards the abyss? And here he is, directly contradicting himself, who earlier had proclaimed his renunciation of all sympathy with the abyss, and here he has an incorrigible, natural tendency towards it. We try to achieve dignity by repudiating that abyss, but whichever way we turn, we are subject to its allurement. We cannot really turn ourselves away from this. We renounce, let us say, the corrosive process of knowledge. We get rid of the idea that knowledge in some way leads necessarily to this. For knowledge, Phaedrus, has neither dignity nor rigour. It is all insight and understanding and tolerance, uncontrolled and formless. So if we do actually understand others, we do understand all experiences, we end up losing ourselves. Having knowledge of the depths of pure beauty for him has resulted in the unravelling of his artistic identity. It sympathizes with the abyss. It's uncontrolled and formless. It is the abyss. And so empathy, understanding, the imagination, all of these things in some ways result in the abyss, the Dionysian revel, the loss of self. And so we reject it resolutely, and henceforth our pursuit is of beauty alone, of beauty which is simplicity, which is grandeur, and a new kind of rigour, and a second naivety, of beauty which is form. And so there we try and in some way reject knowledge and worship beauty. But form and naivety, Phaedrus, lead to intoxication and lust. And so we convince ourselves that worshipping form and beauty is some way more moralistic and elevating, but actually it necessarily, as his is the case, leads to intoxication and lust. We can't chase beauty down without inspiring the libido and the passions. They may lead a noble mind into terrible criminal emotions, which is exactly what he has found, which his own fine rigour condemns as infamous. Yet they too lead to the abyss. And so there's nowhere else other than destruction that artistic inspiration can take you. I tell you that is where they lead us, writers, for we are not capable of self-exaltation. We are merely capable of self-debauchery. We cannot, in all of the end goals of art, do anything other than degrade ourselves. And now I shall go, Phaedrus, and you shall stay here and leave this place only when you no longer see me. And so here, he's doomed by passion to immorality. He's doomed by artistic endeavour to this state of self-destruction. And this is an interesting allegorical perspective on the state of artistic inspiration. It does seem to lead to disproportionate levels of self-destruction. Just if you think of the kind of the cliched narrative of a young genius artistically inspired and then committing suicide, there is something about the artistic life that Aschenbach seems to be articulating here in allegorical terms that leads to this complete sense of degradation and destruction. And so we see a man here that seems still to be clinging on to the intellectualization of this through the extension of this allegorical narrative, this allegorical allusion to Socrates and Phaedrus. He's still clinging on to this wise persona, even as the true wisdom that he articulates here is about the necessity of self-destruction in artistic endeavour.